there are certainly receptive ears to each one of those constituencies in Congress. But unless you find a broad enough appeal where members of Congress and senators can say, I'm doing X to benefit my constituents, and here's how, and here's what they want, it's very difficult to translate those individual opinions into a voting bloc.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Tyler Williams, Head of Policy at Galaxy Digital. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting builders, founders, and investors from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Tyler at Galaxy Digital. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Tanner, and this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast. I'm here today with Tyler Williams, Head of Policy at Galaxy Digital. Tyler, what's up? How are you doing today?
Hey, Tanner. Everything is good. Sunny day in DC, and I appreciate being here on the podcast with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited. This is actually seems like kind of the perfect time to be having the conversation we're about to have. So I'm excited to learn and kind of dive in on all this. So maybe just to start, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your story and especially kind of how crypto intersects with that story. So if you could just kind of maybe kick us off a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Glad to do that. Well, maybe I'll work backwards from now until the start of my career because it makes some sort of sense in concentric circles.
Okay.
So been at Galaxy for 2 years as the head of policy. Just came up on the 2-year anniversary actually this week. And it's been an interesting and wild ride over the course of 2022 in the crypto economy. Prior to that, I ran my own consulting firm working with a multi-client advocacy firm in DC as an advisory person, and then also running my own consulting business in politics, but also in business, working to help corporations basically take data and infuse it into their public course engagement. And then immediately prior to that, I was at the Treasury Department for 2 years in domestic finance, where I oversaw the Office of Financial Institutions Policy, the Federal Insurance Office, and then also worked on housing finance and digital assets as part of the digital asset working group at Treasury. And then prior to Treasury, I spent almost 8 years in the House and the Senate, always working on financial services and tax issues. And then I started my career in New York as a researcher and running a research team at an expert network, where I focused a lot of my work on the intersection between tech and financial services. No one called it fintech then. It was just tech applications and non-enterprise organizations as they relate to banks and insurance and housing finance. So spent most of my career in financial services and then have spent a decent amount of time on the digital asset world prior to coming to Galaxy as well.
Very cool. Okay. I do catch kind of in retrospect how it kind of seems like you're actually perfectly positioned for what you do. So very cool. I think an interesting place to start might be just talking about the general posture of market regulators and even maybe the executive branch towards crypto, because I think, from within crypto, right, there is this narrative of a little bit of a battle going on or a little bit of a adversarial relationship. And so I'm curious if you could just talk about that posture of regulators and the executive branch, maybe to just kick us off.
Well, I think if I had one word to describe it, it's complicated. And it's complicated, I think, largely driven by where the conversation started at the beginning of this administration. And I think it was a posture of sort of guarded enthusiasm towards the administration and all the independent market regulators as well, the independent market regulators being predominantly the Securities and Exchange Commission and the CFTC. And I think if you look back a couple of years ago, where we started was the administration to put out this executive order and had taken sort of a thoughtful, methodical approach to gathering information and writing reports, and looked like they were going to take a holistic view across the government in many ways, as the administration did at the early onset of the internet revolution. And I think if you hit a fast forward button, a lot happened in 2022 that I think has been infused in the regulatory approach to the sector. And it's hard to ignore the blowups of 2022 and how that impacts not only the precise work product output from the regulators, but also their methodology and mindset when they're looking at the policy issues. And I think if you take the macro look on the sort of policy perceptions that have taken place in some of the leadership at these regulators, I think no regulator has gotten in trouble in the past for taking a extremely conservative approach to new technologies or issues. And it's very easy in the government to say no to an issue, very difficult to say yes. And you expose yourself to vulnerabilities when you say yes. So I think as you look down the waterfall of issues, whether it's the custody proposal and the safeguarding rule from the SEC, or if it's the exchange definition, the broker-dealer issues, all of the panoply of things that are happening in the federal government, I think you can see in that infused this embedded approach from a personnel perspective that has come into play in the digital asset space.
Makes sense. Okay, interesting. Hey everybody, quick thing here. We're excited to announce WAGMI Advisory, your home for all things fundraising, hiring, and partnerships. This is all about supercharging your project with the WAGMI network consisting of over 20,000 executives, investors, and builders in crypto, all ready to come alongside your project to help it succeed. Get in touch at team@wagmiventures.io to learn more and figure out if WAGMI Advisory is the right fit for your project. Now, let's get back to the show. So, you mentioned a couple issues already, but I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about any kind of key legislative battles on the horizon and sort of how crypto fits into that bigger picture.
Absolutely. Well, again, it's a super complicated question because I think you have to take it a bucketed approach to analyzing the issue. And I think the legislating environment for anything is really complicated right now. If you look at the majorities that are in place in the House and the Senate, the House has a slight Republican majority. The Senate has a slight Democratic majority. And then you obviously have a Democratic president in the White House. And so when you have divided government, the areas of compromise are already really narrow. And then if you look at the macro picture in the globe, the things that Congress writ large are fighting about are related to immigration policy, to border security, to the appropriations debate, to funding for a foreign aid bill. So these things are really, really complicated. And just if you've seen, the actions of the past 2 days, the Senate had voted to advance consideration on an underlying bill for foreign aid. So for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. And then the House has sort of said as a negotiating position that it's going to be tough for them, maybe unlikely for them to pass any foreign aid bill unless there is embedded border security and immigration policy that's associated with that. So I think if you look at the top line, it's just really challenging to get anything done. And then you have embedded in that these deadlines for appropriations. I believe they start next week and go towards the early side of March. Those are huge issues that Congress has to get through. And as it relates to crypto, we've seen really substantive action from the Financial Services Committee and the House Agricultural Committee in advancing work products for a market structure regulatory regime, i.e., giving the SEC and the CFTC expanded authority to regulate the spot market for digital asset securities and commodities. And we've seen them be able to advance those bills out of the respective committees, which is a huge mile marker. But we haven't seen them advance to the House floor. And we largely haven't seen that because getting floor time to consider these bills that are they're not important relative to the other macro things that are happening that we talked about just a minute ago. So it makes it really challenging to get these things advanced through Congress. So I think that's what we're seeing in the House. And I think the Senate, when it compares that, they're just not as far along in terms of their thinking and their work on digital asset issues in the way that the House is. So we're seeing the debate in the Senate be much more focused on money laundering and the Bank Secrecy Act. And specifically, we saw at the early part of this year, a lot of focus on Hamas and terrorist financing and the role and participation of the crypto economy in that. And we've seen lots of hearings on these issues in terms of terrorist financing. So I think the two bodies are really far apart in terms of what they're working on. How that all aligns in terms of getting a work product done, I think is a big open question. I'm not saying it's impossible to solve, but you have to have a trade, essentially. Whenever there's divided government, you have to look for areas where there's a trading chit between the stakeholders and participants in the issue. So as we see these big pieces of legislation move through Congress, whether it's the appropriations bills or these other must-pass vehicles relative to border security or immigration or whatever it might be, we have to look at those and say, are these vehicles that a deal can be had relative to crypto? And I think it's possible, but I think it's like a really low possibility at present.
Super, super interesting. Okay. Really helpful breakdown. I'm curious, there's this narrative about, how crypto hasn't historically been and isn't always the most unified front in the policy battle. And I think that has resulted in kind of a narrative of how crypto self-defeats sometimes. I was curious if you could maybe comment a little bit on that self-defeating tendency that seems to have occasionally popped up, and just generally that narrative, how crypto self-defeats in this policy battles.
Yeah, I think there's so many different facets of the crypto industry that there's oftentimes really divergent opinions about what should happen. So there's participants from the centralized intermediary approach, whether or not they're trading venues or custodians or exchanges, that have a vested interest in regulatory certainty, like their operations and the customers they are serving, whether or not they're retail or institutional, they rely on some type of certainty from a regulatory perspective. And then there's different parts of the industry that are very focused on like the individual self-sovereignty principles that are embedded within the crypto economy. And those oftentimes overlay with policymakers in a position where they're appealing to certain constituencies within Congress. And there are certainly receptive ears to each one of those constituencies in Congress. But unless you find a broad enough appeal where members of Congress and senators can say, I'm doing X to benefit my constituents, and here's how, and here's what they want, it's very difficult to translate those individual opinions into a voting block. So I think that's why we see sometimes this notion of like the self-defeats in policy battles. I wouldn't call it self-defeat so much as there are really divergent opinions of what should happen and what the regulatory landscape should look like for different pieces of the crypto economy, that it makes it challenging to produce an outcome when it comes to like a legislative product. And I think you can even extrapolate that when you look at some of the rulemakings that have happened from the different venues, whether it's the IRS, whether it's the SEC or the CFTC. You see a lot of really diverse views in the commentary for those rulemaking processes.
Got it. Super interesting. That makes a ton of sense. So as an outsider to DC, right, I get the sense sometimes that crypto isn't always seen as the most legitimate industry or the most, we've already talked a little bit about how it's a little bit disparate in the voices and the priorities of those voices. But I'm curious, if we just kind of took as an assumption that maybe crypto as an industry has some room to go to legitimize itself in DC, what would that look like? How would you, I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think I'm going to view legitimizing DC as producing outcomes. And to me, what most, like, let's just talk about the legislative side of things, because I think it's the most salient to like the notion of legitimizing itself. If crypto can be successful at translating functional uses in a very real way to people, it'll find success in Washington. And that's when you hear this notion of policymakers and legislators asking for, show me the real world use case, even though I hate that phrasing and I hate that request, because I think in many parts, the crypto economy is a use case for itself. You have a $1 trillion+ marketplace that is participating in an economy that they have built within themselves. Like, that is a huge use case itself. And then you think about stable coins and you think about products like that can have foundational impact to the projection of the US dollar. Those are very real use cases. But I think if crypto can demonstrate the the utility in a voting block mentality. In other words, if they can find in every state in the country a voting block of participants and people who are single issue voters on crypto, like that'll change the game of how policy people pay attention, because all of a sudden it'll go from this diverse group of people to very isolated voting blocks. And neither side of the aisle can ignore a specific voting block in their district or in their state relative to these issues.
Super interesting. Okay. So, it's 2024. I'd be remiss to not ask about the election coming up. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, really just the impact of the election on some of these broader legislative conversations, or, how do you think about the election playing into some of these issues we've been talking about?
I think it's monumental. However, I think anyone who told you that they knew which way the election was going to go, it's a jump ball to me at the moment. But what I would say is that if you look back at major legislating positions, whether it was in 2017 when there was comprehensive tax reform that was done, the previous era of tax reform hadn't been done since 1986. And if you think about that only happened because we had unified government. And if you look back and on the early era of President Obama, the legislating successes that he achieved relative to the Affordable Care Act and to the Dodd-Frank Act, those things only happened because they had unified government. So I would say on either side, and I really believe that crypto is a nonpartisan issue. You have people on both sides of the aisle that care about this and are willing to work with each other on the issues. That if we have more divided government as we have right now, it's very difficult to produce outcomes on a legislating side, which makes people turn to the executive branch and the independent regulators and say, well, what can you do to solve these issues? But I would say whatever impact the election has on the makeup of Congress will be instructive to whether or not there are possibilities for outcomes on a legislating and regulatory basis for the digital asset ecosystem. And that's my gut right now, that it's a jump ball. But if we have unified government in some construct, it marginally improves. If we have a unified Congress in one party and a president in the opposite political party, I do think that too marginally improves the chances of having certainty in the United States. And let me add one more thing. I think that the actions in Europe and the UK, and MiCA is coming into force in December. So we have these other jurisdictions that, particularly in like the Western world, that are taking a more progressive tone and approach towards the sector. So I think there'll be some lessons learned from those examples internationally that might have a more pronounced impact in the United States in 2025, because we'll have almost a year of understanding their impact and how they can be translatable in terms of U.S. regulatory or legislative actions.
Love it. Tyler, I get the sense, all these moving pieces, it's a very uncertain future, but it's one that I think we're all along for the ride on. And I really appreciate you coming on the show to kind of share your perspective and expertise here with the listeners. So have a great rest of your week here. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Tanner. Love being with you.
All right. Bye-bye. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and maybe give us a good 5-star rating and subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts so you can get all the latest conversations with the most interesting crypto founders, investors, and builders from across the world. Thanks so much. Have a good one.